A life reclaimed at 75. Her name is Eleanor Rose Whitman, and she turned 75 on the 14th of November, a Tuesday so still that the frost on her bungalow windows looked like lace spun by an old woman who had all the time in the world. The bungalow sat at the edge of a small coastal town in Maine, the kind of place where tourists came in summer and left behind faded postcards, and the locals stayed because the sea had gotten into their blood. The house was painted the soft gray of driftwood, with white trim that Eleanor repainted herself every third spring, climbing the ladder slowly, carefully, humming old hymns her mother used to sing while hanging laundry. That birthday morning, the only sound was the distant hush of waves and the small click of her kitchen match as she lit a single beeswax. Candle stuck into a blueberry muffin from Harbor Bakery. The muffin was still warm. She had walked the half-mile there and back before the gulls were fully awake. She closed her eyes the way she once did when her children were small, tight, earnest, believing, and made a wish she barely dared to name. Let this year be truly mine. Then she blew. The flame bowed, surrendered, and was gone. A thin ribbon of smoke rose toward the cedar-beamed ceiling, carrying with it every year she had spent waiting to be chosen. Eleanor had bought the bungalow 30 years earlier. In 1995, the year Harold died. He had gone quickly, one moment raking autumn leaves in the yard of their old split level in Portland, the next clutching his chest and looking at her with startled blue eyes that seemed to ask, "Is this it?" She had held him until the ambulance came, whispering, it's all right, even though nothing was. The life insurance was modest, the pension smaller still. But combined with her own savings from 42 years as a school librarian, it was enough for the down payment on this little house by the sea. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a kitchen with windows that looked straight out to the Atlantic, and a sun porch where the light poured in like melted butter every afternoon. She remembered the day she signed the papers. The realtor, a kind woman named Ruth with coral lipstick, had said, "It's perfect for one person." Eleanor had smiled and nodded, but inside she felt something sharp and bright flare up, perfect for one person. After 50 years of being 2, then 3, then 4, then 5 with grandchildren added to holidays. The idea of space measured only for herself felt both terrifying and electric. Her daughter Sarah and son David had driven down from Portland to help her move. Sarah was 30 then, pregnant with her first child, glowing and distracted. David was 28, newly engaged, full of plans for his contracting business. They carried boxes of books, hundreds of them, because Eleanor could never bear to part with a story, and Harold's old leather armchair that smelled faintly of pipe, tobacco, and drugstore aftershave. They stayed for lunch, lobster rolls from the shack down the road, eaten on the sun porch while gulls wheeled overhead. Sarah promised, "We'll be down every weekend, Mom. Family dinners. The kids will grow up knowing this house," David added. "And if you ever need anything fixed, just call. I'm only an hour away." Eleanor had believed them. She had spent her whole life believing promises like that. The weekends became every other weekend, then once a month, then mostly holidays. The grandchildren arrived. 3 for Sarah, 2 for David, and Eleanor drove up to Portland for birthdays. Recitals, soccer games, always with a trunk full of books and homemade jam. She babysat when parents needed date nights, hosted Thanksgivings where she cooked from 5 a.m. until the turkey came out, golden at 3 p.m., washed every dish alone while the family watched football in the other room. She told herself it was what mothers did. She told herself it was what grandmothers were for. She told herself loneliness was the price of love. But slowly, quietly, she began to build a life that belonged only to her. She painted the bedroom walls a soft sage green, the exact shade of sea glass she collected on her morning walks. She planted a wildflower garden in the front yard. Poppies, cosmos, black-eyed Susans that bloomed in glorious disorder every summer. Neighbors driving by would slow down to look at the riot of color and shake their heads. Smiling, Eleanor liked that they noticed. Her one great indulgence was a deep navy velvet armchair she found at an estate sale in Camden. It was too large for the small living room, but she bought it anyway. When the afternoon light slanted through the sun porch windows, the velvet drank it in and gave it back as quiet blue fire. She read there for hours. Jane Austen again, Mary Oliver's poems, thick historical novels about women who disguised themselves as men to go to sea. On the mantel above the fireplace, she placed a single, framed photograph herself at 65, taken by a kind stranger on the rocky beach just below the house. Her silver hair was loose and wild in the wind, her face tilted toward the sun, and she was smiling a smile she barely recognized. Open, unguarded, almost fierce, as if at that moment she had remembered her own name. She learned the small, delicious freedoms of living alone. She played her old Billie Holiday and Ella. Fitzgerald records at full volume on Sunday mornings while making pancakes she ate straight from the pan. She left books open face down on every surface. She bought fresh flowers every Friday, lilies, tulips, whatever was most fragrant, and let them drop. Petals on the floor without rushing to sweep. She stayed up until 2 a.m. reading by lamplight because no one sighed about the electric bill. She ate ice cream for dinner on the hottest nights of summer, sitting on the sun porch in her nightgown, listening to buoys clanging out in the dark. She traveled too, small trips at first. A week on Monhegan Island sketching puffins. A long weekend in Boston to see an exhibit of impressionist paintings. She went alone, ate in restaurants alone, walked museums alone, and discovered she liked her own company far more than she had ever been allowed to know. Years slipped by like tides. She turned 70, then 72, then 74, and the visits from family grew even fewer. The grandchildren became teenagers with busy lives. Sarah and David both had successful careers. Sarah in marketing, David running his own construction firm. They texted photos of vacations in Aruba, new kitchen renovations, college acceptance letters. Eleanor sent congratulations, gift cards, hand-knitted scarves. They thanked her, promised to visit soon. Soon never quite arrived. And then came the afternoon that changed everything. It was the 3rd of February, a day so bright the snow on the dunes glared like polished crystal. Eleanor had walked her usual route along the shoreline, boots crunching through frozen sand, collecting sea glass and smooth white stones worn soft by centuries of waves. She carried a small canvas bag that smelled of salt and cold air. In town, she stopped at the bakery for a loaf of sourdough still warm from the oven, its crust crackling when she pressed it gently. She was humming My Funny Valentine under her breath as she climbed the 3 steps to her front door, key already in hand. The key turned, the door opened, and the familiar scent of her home, beeswax polish, dried lavender from the sachets she made each summer. The faint salt tang that never quite left the air was suddenly overpowered by something sharp, expensive, citrusy. Sarah's perfume. Eleanor froze in the doorway. Sarah stood in the center of the living room in a camel-colored cashmere coat, arms crossed, one booted foot tapping impatiently on Eleanor's braided wool rug. Behind her, her husband. Tom wrestled 2 enormous North Face duffels through the sun porch door. Clothes spilled out like bright entrails. Cashmere sweaters, running leggings, children's toys, a laptop bag, noise-canceling headphones. On the navy velvet armchair lay Sarah's designer coat, draped possessively, as though staking territory. The grandchildren, Lily 15, Ben 13, and little Grace 10, were already scattered about. Lily sat cross-legged on the sun porch scrolling her phone, earbuds in. Ben was testing the springs of Eleanor's antique sofa by bouncing lightly. Grace had opened the kitchen cabinet and was examining Eleanor's collection of sea glass jars as if deciding which to claim. Sarah looked up from her own phone and flashed the bright, efficient smile she used in boardrooms. "Oh, Mom, there you are? We got here about an hour ago. Hope that's okay." The canvas bag slipped from Eleanor's suddenly numb fingers. A piece of rose-colored sea glass skittered across the pine floor and came to rest against the leg of the coffee table. The sourdough loaf hit the edge of the entry table and split neatly in 2, steam escaping like a sigh. Sarah kept talking, words pouring out in the brisk, unstoppable way she had when closing a business deal. "It's literally just temporary, 2 or 3 weeks, tops. Our house had a catastrophic plumbing failure. The entire downstairs is flooded. They have to rip up floors, replace pipes, dry everything out with industrial fans. It's unlivable. Noise, dust, strangers in and out all day. The kids can't concentrate on schoolwork. David said you wouldn't mind. You've got that whole second bedroom just sitting there empty." David said, "Not we called to ask. Not would this be all right? Not Mom, we're in trouble. Can you help?" David said you wouldn't mind. Eleanor stood very still. She looked at the coat claiming her chair. She looked at the muddy boot print already, ground into the cream-colored Afghan she had, knitted over 3 winters. She looked at the empty sourdough paper bag crumpled on the floor. She looked at her daughter, 48 years old, successful, confident, still carrying the unconscious expectation that the world, and especially her mother, would rearrange itself the moment she felt discomfort. And then she looked at her son, David, who who had just come in from the car carrying another load, a PlayStation console, a box of single-origin coffee pods, and the easy grin of a man who had rarely, if ever, been told no by the woman who once stayed up all night with him when he had croup, rocking him until dawn. "Hey, Mom," David said, leaning in to kiss the air near her cheek without quite touching. "You're a lifesaver. We'll be out of your hair by Valentine's Day at the latest, promise." He dropped the box on the coffee table. The corner landed squarely on the hardback library book. Eleanor had waited 10 weeks to check out an oral history of women lighthouse keepers. The spine cracked audibly. A muddy fingerprint bloomed across the dust jacket. Something that had been tightly knotted inside. Eleanor's chest for 50 years, maybe longer, loosened all at once. "No," she said. The word came out soft, almost wondering, like the first note of a song she had forgotten she knew how to sing. The room went perfectly still. Tom paused in the doorway, duffel half lifted. Sarah's smile froze and cracked at the edges. Even the grandchildren looked up from their screens. David laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "Come on, Mom, it's us." "No," Eleanor said again, louder this time, tasting the shape of it, marveling at how solid it felt in her mouth. "This is my home. These rooms are not spare. They are mine. Every inch of this house, every shelf, every chair, every quiet morning, I have earned them. I love you all more than I have words for, but you do not get to arrive unannounced. With suitcases and children and expectations and treat my life like emergency overflow. You should have called. You should have asked. And even if you had asked, the answer would still be no. I have waited my entire adult life to live for myself, and I will not give it away in pieces anymore. Not even to the people I love most." Silence fell, thick and electric, broken only by the distant cry of a gull outside. Sarah recovered first. "Mom, this is insane. It's family. It's a few weeks on a perfectly good guest bed." "It's my life," Eleanor said, calm as the low tide at dawn. David's face flushed deep red. "You're seriously putting us out in the cold? With the kids? Over a bedroom? I'm asking you to respect me enough to leave when I say no. There are hotels in town. There are vacation rentals. There are other solutions. I am no longer one of them." The argument lasted 43 minutes. Eleanor counted every tick of the grandfather clock Harold had bought the year David graduated high school. 43 minutes of rising voices, accusations, tears from Grace, eye-rolling from Lily, Sarah talking about rigid boundaries, and lack of empathy and elder isolation, David listing every sacrifice he believed entitled him to her compliance. He used the word selfish 14 times. He brought up the college loans they never fully repaid her for helping with. The years she watched the grandchildren every summer week so they could travel. The Thanksgivings she hosted alone in the kitchen until midnight. The emergency fund she dipped into when David's business had a slow year. The nights she drove through blizzards to sit with sick grandkids so parents could sleep. Eleanor never once raised her voice. She stood by the open front door with her hands loose at her sides, the cold February air pouring in around her, and repeated the same quiet sentences until they filled the room and left no space for anything else. "This is my home. I love you, but the answer is no. You should have asked. I am choosing myself this time." Finally, bags were repacked with angry zipping and muttering. One wheel on a duffel, snapped off and rolled under. The sofa like something trying to hide. Sarah's coat was snatched from the navy chair with unnecessary force. David muttered, "Fine. Enjoy your solitude. Mom, don't come crying to us when you need help someday and no one answers." The door closed behind them with a finality that rattled. The sea glass jars on the kitchen shelf. Then the bungalow fell into the deepest, most perfect silence Eleanor had ever heard. She stood in the middle of the living room for a long while, listening to her own heartbeat. Slowly, she began to restore order. She picked up the broken sourdough, salvaged the softer half, and ate it standing at the counter with butter and honey. She folded Sarah's forgotten scarf into a neat square and laid it on the porch railing for them to collect later. She wiped the muddy prints from her afghan with a damp cloth, mourning the stain but refusing to discard the blanket. She rescued her library book, smoothed the cracked spine as best she could, and placed it gently on the shelf. Then she walked to the sun porch, slid the windows wide, and let the cold, salt wind pour through the house until every trace of citrus perfume was gone. That night she cried in the shower, not from doubt, there was none, but from the deep physical ache of finally straightening a bone that had healed crooked decades ago. The pain was proof it was mending true. She slept diagonally across her queen bed for the first time in 50 years, arms and legs spread wide like a child making snow angels. Morning came pale and sharp. Her phone began to buzz almost immediately. The family group chat exploded. 237 new messages by noon. Guilt trips, prayer hand emojis, memes about selfish boomers, photos of the grandchildren holding signs that read, "We miss you, Grandma, already, and why can't we stay with you?" Someone had posted a screenshot of a psychology article about elderly isolation and narcissism. Eleanor read until her eyes burned, then turned off notifications entirely. She brewed tea exactly the way she liked it. Strong Earl Grey with real cream, and 2 spoons of sugar, and carried it to the sun porch in her favorite chipped mug. She sat there until noon in her flannel nightgown and robe, watching fishing boats head out past the breakwater, because no one was there to tell her she was wasting the day. In the weeks that followed, she lived more vividly than she had in years. She bought herself 3 dozen pale pink tulips simply because they made her gasp. When she saw them in the market, she ate an entire lemon meringue pie over 3 days, slice by slice while reading on the sun porch. She signed up for a watercolor class at the community center and laughed until she cried when her first attempt at painting the lighthouse ran into a muddy gray puddle. The teacher, a kind retired fisherman named Walt, said, "That's not failure, Eleanor, that's the ocean having its say." She painted anyway. Stormy seascapes in indigo and black when the anger finally arrived weeks late. Delicate studies of sea glass glowing on wet sand. Portraits of single blueberry muffins with candles. She learned to dance alone in the kitchen to Nina. Simone while bread rose on the counter. She left wet towels on the bathroom floor. Overnight just to prove the world did not end. She drove to Acadia National Park by herself one weekend, hiked slowly up Cadillac Mountain, and watched the sunrise paint the sky colors no camera could capture. 53 days after the suitcases, her phone rang with a number she almost didn't recognize because calls had grown so rare. Sarah. Eleanor let it ring 6 times, then answered. "Mom." Sarah's voice was small, scraped raw. "Can we talk?" "Just you and me, please." They met at the Harbor Cafe, the one with mismatched chairs, and the waitress who called. Everyone hung. Sarah arrived first, already seated at a window table, hands wrapped around a mug as if trying to warm something deeper than fingers. She looked older than 48. New lines around her eyes. Hair pulled back severely, no makeup. She spoke first, no defenses, no script. "I've been horrible," she said quietly. "We both have. We told ourselves you liked being needed because it made it easier to keep taking. We planned our lives assuming you'd always be the safety net. When you said no, it felt like the floor dropped out, but mostly it felt like waking up. I'm so sorry, Mom, I don't want to lose you. But more than that, I don't want the old version where your life only existed when we needed something from it. I want you. The real you. Even, no, especially, when the real you says no." Eleanor looked across the small table and saw the little girl who used to fall asleep on her lap during thunderstorms, clutching a fistful of her sweater. She reached out and covered Sarah's cold hands with her own warm ones. "Thank you," she said, voice steady as the horizon. "That's all I ever needed to hear." They cried quietly while the waitress refilled coffee and pretended not to notice. David called 2 days later and said nearly the same words, voice cracking. Healing was slow and imperfect. Old habits died hard and ugly. There were still texts that assumed availability, invitations that forgot to ask, moments when someone started a sentence with, "You don't have anything planned this weekend, right?" But every single time, Eleanor answered with the same gentle, immovable no. And every time it grew easier. Sarah started calling a week in advance to ask if a certain Saturday would work for a visit. David sent actual handwritten letters, real paper, real stamps, thanking her for specific things from childhood. He was only now understanding. The grandchildren learned to text. "Can we come over Saturday, Grandma? We'll bring lunch and help weed the garden if you want." Some evenings now, Eleanor sits in her navy velvet chair as twilight settles over the water. Like a soft blanket, the sea turns pewter, then indigo, then black scattered with reflected stars. The spare bedroom still has a bed made up with crisp white, linens and extra pillows. But the closet is full of canvases waiting for paint, skeins of soft yarn and colors she loves, shelves of books with cracked spines from being read 3 times. The rooms are empty of other people's emergencies and suitcases. They are full of her, And if anyone ever asks why she didn't just let them stay a few weeks, Eleanor smiles, that slow, radiant smile of a woman who finally knows her own weight in the world and says, because love that only takes is a thief in the night. Real love leaves the porch light on, knocks gently, waits to be invited, and celebrates when the door is opened freely. I closed mine for one afternoon so I could finally open it wide. For myself, first and forever. That is Eleanor's whole story. A quiet, unbreakable revolution that began with uninvited duffels, scattered sea glass, a cracked loaf of bread, and a single word she waited 75 years to say out loud. No, you are allowed to say it too. The rooms you've been keeping empty for everyone else have been waiting for you all along. I promise.